Welcome back to the FM Garage. In this episode of Facebook Live, we are going to talk about some very, shall we say, controversial topics. If you have any questions about any of this, feel free to drop a comment below. I will be answering a ton of questions as we go throughout this, but if you have a question that we didn't answer, we will reply to your comment and get it taken care of. So join with me. My name is Mike, by the way, and we're going to discuss coolant reroutes. What are they? Why do you need them? Who can use them? So there's a ton of misinformation around coolant reroutes that has been circulating on the internet for years and years. Some is true. There's a lot that isn't. So what we want to talk about today is coolant reroutes. To start off, what is a coolant reroute? So over here, I have a very fine drawing. We actually commissioned the most talented 5-year-old we could find at our local preschool to draw this for us. So this, for our purposes, is an engine. This is a Miata engine. This specifically is going to apply to all the 1990 up to 2005 engines, and of course things are going to be slightly different between the ones those years, but for all intents and purposes we're looking at 4 cylinders, engine block, a head, and then all of the stock coolant routing will have a water pump on the front and a thermostat on the front. So as you can see, this engine with the water pump is drawing in cold water from the radiator. It gets pushed through all these coolant passages between the cylinders and then goes up into the head. This portion right here comes out, meets our thermostat, and when the thermostat is, or the coolant is warmed up, the thermostat opens and that hot water goes out to the radiator to be cooled down and then complete the cycle again. So this is a normal stock routing for a B6 or BP engine. Now, a lot of people see this and say, yeah, that looks fine. You're getting cold fluid in, hot fluid out, right? The problem here is that because of this orientation, you've got an inlet and an outlet on the same, basically the front face of the engine. A lot of this coolant has to travel way to the back before it comes around. And a lot of times this cylinder, usually number 4 and sometimes even part of number 3, will stay much warmer than the first 2 cylinders. So this coolant has a lot less travel between the water pump and the outlet. That this water that's coming through here generally is going to be a little bit cooler versus the coolant that goes through the engine block and then up and around here is going to pick up a lot more heat, and so these cylinders generally will stay warmer. Now, is this a problem? Sometimes. Generally speaking, with this kind of an arrangement on an everyday stock car, you're just driving it to and from work, you're not doing any kind of sport driving or aggressive driving or any kind of, shall we say, spirited driving, this obviously works fine. There's hundreds or thousands or even tens or maybe even 100,000s of Miatas that have been running around without coolant reroutes for years and years and years, and they're just fine. Now, is this ideal? Not necessarily. Now, the reason Mazda did this is that in this configuration, this is what fit best in the car. Now, I'm sure a lot of you know that the original B6 or 1.6 liter engines that Mazda put in the Miatas originally came out of, or at least have a very close heritage with, the Mazda 323. And in those engine bays, instead of having an engine that's front and back like this, it was side to side. It was a front wheel drive platform. So in those applications, they'd have the water pump on the front, but then they'd have the outlet here at the back. So that flow would go naturally from front to back throughout that engine. Because we have the front back orientation of the engines in these cars, you can't do that, or at least Mazda didn't want to do that because packaging was very tight. You're up against the firewall right about here. So to make it easier for maintenance and to be able to replace parts, Mazda decided to do the thermostat housing up at the front. It's a compromise, but it was something that basically they wanted to do because it was probably cheaper, it probably made more sense packaging wise, and it was likely easier for them to assemble it at the factory. So that's kind of how it happened and why we're dealing with this in the first place. So in this kind of a scenario, to make this a better or idealized coolant routing through your engine, one of the things that we like to do is you either cap this off all together, so that way you're not getting a coolant outlet here, and then also going to the back and having another little thermostat housing basically on the back, so that way your coolant can go from the front to the back, and that way the coolant that goes across all of your 4 of your cylinders will stay much more consistent in temperature. And so this is an ideal routing to keep all 4 cylinders as close as possible temperature wise. Now what that'll do is that on number 3 and number 4 cylinders that are normally warmer, you can get sometimes accelerated wear depending upon how the car is driven. You know, if you're driving this car hard or spirited on the track, you name it, then you're going to see higher temperatures that are going to be more focused towards the back of the engine, and your piston rings and other moving parts back here are going to experience a little bit more wear than they might normally otherwise have compared to the front 2 cylinders. So having a setup like this is basically putting it back to what Mazda originally designed with the 323s. So along with this, I've got some parts. Let's go ahead and I'll show you the reroute kit that we have, which is right over here. So there are many reroutes out, and have been many reroutes out on the market for a long time. It's not an uncommon thing to do for a Miata engine. We recently came out with this design that we basically took notes from all of the reroutes that have been out over time throughout the marketplace and tried to come up with one that had all the best attributes and fitment in one package. Now you can see that this one, it looks a little bit different than other reroutes on the market, and some things you say, oh yeah, that looks familiar. But basically what this is the back housing that would bolt to the back of the head, your thermostat that's included with this kit. This is a little bit different from your standard stock thermostat, so it is a specific one for this application. But you have your thermostat here. It gets bolted, gets bolted to the back of your engine on the head, and then you have the outlet here that sends your coolant off to the radiator to get cooled down. So it is a tight fit back there, but we have managed to package in pretty much all of the features that you want in a coolant reroute. You can see I've already preloaded it with a few of the stock sensors, as well as some of the items that come with this kit. This one is a bit of a mix mash. If you have one of the earlier NAs, you're going to have a coolant temperature sensor like that. Some of them will also have a sensor like this. These little guys, there's 3 of these holes, one right here, one right here, one right here, are all 1/8 NPT. So depending on if your car has this sensor as a stock sensor, you can use this port right here. You can also see here that we've got another guy up on top, and that might look familiar to you if you have an aftermarket brake kit. It's very similar. This is a bleed valve. So after the installation, you can use this bleed valve along with some hose that we supplied to help bleed any air bubbles out of your cooling system. Now back over to this side, you can see that there's a big hose barb right here. This is for the heater bypass hoses. You'll have one that goes to the back of the head naturally, so to keep that in place, we have provision for that here. Now you're probably wondering, what the heck are these other 2 open holes? So if you have a turbo kit, this also gives you another option to route the coolant that goes to your turbo and then back again. Now in this reroute, we tried to design it pretty smartly as far as how all the coolant is gathered and then put back into the system. You'll see that there is this extra passageway right here. Now when this is bolted to the back of the engine, this part, the big opening, is covered by the thermostat. And so you don't want to have a coolant passage coming from after this thermostat that's feeding your turbo. You want to be able to have some flow to the turbo all the time if possible. So this little extra passage here still gets coolant flow even before your thermostat opens. So this passage will feed coolant to this sensor or this port. It'll also feed to your heater core, and then it also feeds to this little port right here that if you're running turbo a turbocharger, you can install a hose barb and then run your water feed to the turbo from there. And then likewise, this one up top, this is the return. So you can feed your return back into there, and then it's kind of hard to see on camera, but that hole feeds back into this outlet. So meaning that your turbocharger gets water straight from out of the back of the head and then returns it not back into the engine, but into the coolant that's going out to the radiator. This is ideal for turbochargers. That way you're not putting in as hot of coolant into the engine as possible. So we did try to make as many design bundles into this as we could. Another thing that you may notice is the strange shape on the bottom. This actually is designed to fit with EGR across all models. Any NA or NB, this will fit just fine. You may need to loosen your EGR pipe to make it fit, but you don't have to delete it. This will fit on their car without removing stock EGR components. This also includes all the hardware that you need to bolt it on. You don't need to make any hardware store runs to make that happen. There are a couple other pieces that are not actually shown here. You can see that there's a big bolt here, but also in this kit that will be included is a block-off plate for your thermostat. And this is the one on the front of the engine. So you can either block it off at the thermostat, kind of like what I showed over here. There's a plate that you can put here that basically you would use that usually for like the 1.6 engines that have a stock fan sensor that's plugged in right there. You can use that plate if you want, or if you want, you can also get rid of it altogether. And there's a second plate that will simply block off that portion altogether so it looks nice and flush and clean. So that's basically it. Oh, I guess one more thing to note is that if you are running some sort of aftermarket engine management, it's very common to have an aftermarket coolant temperature sensor, which most of them are also 1/8 MPT, so you could use one of these ports for that purpose if you wanted to. Another thing that is or can be an issue is grounding issues. Basically, on NB2s in particular, the way that they're actually, I think that's all NBs now that I think about it, they have a temperature gauge that will fluctuate if you don't have a good ground on your sensor. So in some other coolant reroutes, you have to use like a grounding strap to be able to make sure that this sensor gets enough passage. Basically, it's grounded out on this piece, and in the engine it's grounded out to the engine. But some reroutes don't have a very good grounding scheme. It's a little bit broken up. So in this one, since it's just one piece, it does a lot better for grounding, and you don't have to run a ground strap, and your coolant gauge won't just suddenly turn on and off because it's having issues making the whole electrical connection. So that's a good easy fit and fix for if you have an issue with your coolant temperature gauge fluctuating all the time. We've been asked, what kind of installation is this? How hard is it to install a coolant reroute on your engine? It's not terrible. You know, this is probably a 3 to 4 hour job, given that you have a pretty basic toolbox. You know, you don't need a whole bunch of specialty tools. There are some things that are a little bit fiddly or maybe hard for some people to get. This is a little snap ring that keeps your thermostat in place. So you may need to get snap ring pliers if you don't already have them, but most other stuff is pretty basic stuff that's included. One of the other things that they were asking about, that we got questions on Instagram and Facebook, thanks for that, by the way, is does this actually, does this improve my cooling efficiency? Sort of. So one of them in particular that is important to realize is that this coolant hose that's included is actually increasing your capacity a little bit for your coolant. So it does give you a little bit more efficiency there, but this is more about idealizing the routing going through the engine than it is about overall efficiency for cooling down a system. That's more about radiators and fans and moving air through the heat exchanger to get rid of that heat. So I see we got a question. Let's stop and we'll answer a question here.
There's a couple questions in one, so I'll try to summarize a little bit. They're just asking for confirmation that the turbo feed bypasses the thermostat, and questions whether if the thermostat is fully open, if there's still enough of a pressure difference to get flow through the turbo, and what about considerations of using an electric water pump with no thermostat?
Okay, so good questions. Basically, they were questions asking about the turbo water feed and the thermostat. So firstly being, does the turbocharger, can it still get adequate pressure when the thermostat is closed? Yes, it certainly can. So this thermostat, when it's in place, as I explained earlier, you're still getting coolant flow down this passageway, which feeds these three, as well as your bleeder and to your temperature sensor. So you're still getting flow through this passage, and your water pump is still spinning as long as your engine is turning. So yes, you will still get good flow throughout this even before your thermostat opens. That's part of why this is a one-piece design and how it has this extra little passageway like that.
It's when the thermostat is open, is there a differential?
Question is, I'm sorry, I misheard that. Question is there enough pressure when the thermostat is open to keep feeding that? Yes, there still is plenty of pressure. The amount of this thermostat opening is actually relatively small. So compared to the space where this little pill opens up or retracts and allows coolant to pass through, is not enough to make a passage of this size lose that much pressure. And the other thing about coolant going through the turbo is that it is good. It is certainly something that if you can factor it into your turbo install, you definitely should. But the primary purpose of coolant going to a turbo is actually cooling it after you've shut off the engine. What? Yeah, I know that sounds weird, but really, if you talk to Garrett or BorgWarner or any of the major manufacturers that have coolant that goes through their turbocharger to help it keep cool, the main purpose for that is that it helps keep the turbo cool after you shut off the engine, because it's allowing a lot of the heat that's in the oil that's no longer actually going through the turbocharger, that is just sitting on some of the components, the bearings inside, to wick that heat away from the turbo instead of letting that oil get so hot in that one place that it cokes up. So there is a term called thermal siphoning. It's pretty interesting if you are interested in learning about that kind of effect, where basically even after you've turned off your engine, your coolant lines, if they're actually hooked up properly and you have the right orientation on your turbo, it'll actually pull coolant out of the turbocharger and continue to remove heat from it after you turn off the engine. That's really the main thing that we're going after here, and that's why instead of having a big honkin', like -6 or -8 line or some large coolant line, we're just using a 5/16 hose barb. It doesn't need a lot of flow. Even when it's going, when the engine's running, it doesn't need a lot of flow. You just need enough to be able to allow coolant to flow through there naturally. Are there any questions? Any other ones that I didn't get?
I think that got them.
Okay. All right. So moving on from there, let's talk about this as an application on the engine first. So coming over here, this is our show car, Captain Bob. So it's an NA8, and this does have our coolant reroute already installed. Now on this engine, as I mentioned before, this kit is designed to fit all 1990 through 2005 engines. Stock applications, of course, if you've got some custom fancy intake manifold or something like that, you may need to make a few changes so that way it fits properly. But you can see here, it's pretty tucked up out of the way as it comes around the back of the engine. And one of the questions that we had received is about the routing on this hose and how important it is to make sure that you get the routing correctly, so that way it doesn't rub, it doesn't have any issues or sag or have any trapped air bubbles. So as you can see, this is fairly horizontal in the same plane here at the radiator as it is going, coming out of the coolant reroute. There is a little bit of a dip as it goes down to the reroute housing here, but the coolant that's in this line is moving fairly quickly, so if you do have a high spot in here, those bubbles are going to get flushed out pretty quickly after the thermostat opens. Another thing that you can do is, because it's all rubber, you can also simply squeeze the hose where you need to and kind of walk it forward, so that way you can help encourage any bubbles that are stuck here to move out to the radiator and then get pushed out the overflow and bleed the system. Likewise, if there's anything on this end or in the reroute, there's that little bleeder valve that we talked about that you can use, open it up as the engine's running. When you see that coolant start to bubble through that little bleeder hose that we include, go back and tighten up that little bleeder screw and you should be good to go. Now, as I mentioned, this is a rubber hose. It does have a silicone liner in it, and you do need to be careful about if it does go past anything metal, especially like if there's any moving parts such as your throttle screw here. You don't want it contacting that. In everybody's case, it might be a little bit different, but you can see in this particular case, we've simply used a few zip ties where necessary to keep it from contacting those kinds of hard surfaces that might cause rips or tears in your hose. So, for the most part, in a stock application, a lot of times you can leave it without too much extra leashing or harnessing, because there's going to be enough components over here that can simply rest on top of it with a couple zip ties to keep it from bouncing around. If you have a aftermarket intake manifold or custom intake manifold, you may need to figure out your own custom solution. But this is something that if you have any questions about it, for sure, just give us a call. We'd be happy to help you out and give you some ideas and see what we can do to make this work out. So now that we've talked about the reroute in the car, why you need it, what things may be affected, the biggest controversy that a lot of people have and have been talking about for a long, long time is head gaskets. And do you need to change out a head gasket before you install it? So let's come over here. I've got a few props that we can talk about and show you. I have a head gasket from each the 94 to 2000, as well as the NB2, the 2001 to 05. I also have a head from each one of those. Now, on these head gaskets, unless you knew what you were looking at, it's kind of difficult to see what's different about them. They're both multi-layer steel units. I'll hold them up here because it's kind of hard to see them against the black table. But at first glance, they look pretty much the same. Now, I've gone through and actually added some yellow beneath all of the holes that are covered up. Now, I only did this on the ones that are different from one to the other. Now, what that means is that, yes, Mazda did make some changes to these head gaskets between 2000 to 2001. And you can see on this one over here, this is the early 94 to 2000. All of these openings, basically the round small holes and the slightly larger holes, these are coolant passages. These other big round holes and then some of these other slots, these ones are actually for oil. So those are not going to be what we're concerned about here. This is all about the coolant passages. So these small ones here, all of this is going to be coolant that's traveling through the heads and the blocks. Now, this early one, you can see that compared to this later style one, there are a few holes that Mazda has that are blocked off. Now, it's a bit curious that these ones are on one side versus the front or back, but they also, most of them have a corresponding hole on the other side of this stud that bolts the head down that's still open. Now, compared to the 2001 to 05, you can see that there are a few holes up here up front that are blocked off compared to this one. And there's a few more back here as well. Now, looking at the back of the head, there are differences here too, but it's not quite as straightforward. They're pretty much, you know, you've got two extra holes, but one of them's blocked up on the other side, so a little bit of difference, but not much. So yes, Mazda did change these, and the reason why is because Mazda knows that when they put this engine in this car, that there is some issue with the flow not reaching the back cylinders quite as much. And so this later head gasket is designed to help promote some more flow to the back of the head before it comes forward. That way more coolant is forced around, and that way the temperatures can stay a little bit more even. But it's still not really solving the problem. This is still kind of a band-aid fix for the routing in this engine. Now, a lot of people say if you have a 2001 to 05 engine and you've got this head gasket, this doesn't work with a coolant reroute. Well, why is that? You still have coolant that comes through these other passages, and it's still going to go out the back of the head. Some people have said that, well, I have had this head gasket, had some cooling issues, and then I swapped to the earlier head gasket and those cooling issues went away. Now, that may be true. Overall, there are more passages open on the earlier head gasket, so you possibly are getting more flow overall with the earlier head gasket. Is this something that would make a big enough difference that is a requirement to change out when you do a coolant reroute kit? No, absolutely not. Matter of fact, I have an MB2 with a stock head gasket, and I'm running a coolant reroute kit on the track with a turbo. No issues. So it certainly does work just fine. It is not by any means a requirement to swap out a head gasket if you're doing a reroute kit. If you're going to be changing out a head gasket because you blew it up or something like that, you may consider going with the earlier style head gasket because it does have more coolant flow, but that's up to you. Both of them do work fine. Now, for instance, let's go ahead and I'll show you what I'm talking about here with these on each one of their heads so you can see the passages. Now, remember, this is going to be the shiny head over here. This is going to be from an NA8, so this is a BP05 head. And the coolant passages are very similar to what's in the 99-2000, the BP4W. And you can see again here, these passages here are the coolant. The large passages and the oval passages are for oil and oil drain back. And then over here, this is the 2001 to 05 on this dirtier head. And it's much the same. Now, if I take this head gasket off, this is the later style engine, mind you, and put on the earlier head gasket, and I check all of the holes, I still have access to all of our major coolant holes. There are some that are going to be covered up here, here, and here, but again, this gasket will work on the later style engines if you want to go that route. Not necessary, but maybe a slight upgrade in cooling flow through the engine block to the head. So that's it. It's not a make or break thing. You're not going to lose tons and tons of power. You're not going to have crazy overheating issues because you have one head gasket or the other. If you do have overheating issues, it's likely that there's something else going on. There's not enough difference in these head gaskets that's going to cause a cooling or overheating issue simply because you have one or the other installed. If you have any questions about this, be sure to give us a call, drop us an email. You can also comment on this video. We'd be happy to talk more about it, but that's kind of the meat and potatoes of the situation that we're talking about. Hopefully that cleared up a lot of the questions and some of the myths surrounding coolant reroutes and head gaskets, and heads in particular. If you need anything else, have any questions about the kit, would like to see how it's installed, that kind of stuff, feel free to drop us a line, and we'd be happy to help you out. Thanks again for joining us. We certainly appreciate your attention. I know this was a long video, so hopefully there's enough of you there that thought this was good information that we can continue to have these kinds of videos on our Facebook Live channel. So thanks again. We certainly appreciate it. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a call, send us an email, comment in the video, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And if we don't talk to you sooner, we'll see you next week around Thursday, at 2 o'clock for the next Facebook Live. Thanks everyone. Keep on boosting.